Hi everyone, my name is Levi Cosijn, and in this video I want to talk about the upcoming new moon in the sign of Gemini. And this will occur on June 3rd, 2019 at around 12 p.m. Central European Time. Now before I go on about this, I want to quickly mention I'm going to start a level 1 astrology course on June 2nd and a level 2 astrology course, which is a little more advanced, on June 6th. And this together with my colleague Carmina Amza. If you are interested, you can find all the details on my website, levicosijn.com. So LEVICOSIJN.com. So a new moon in Gemini. What happens during a new moon is that the sun and the moon join together in the zodiac. In fact, sun and moon have the same ecliptic longitude, right? You can see this here. Sun and moon are at 12 degrees and 33 minutes of the sign of Gemini. Ecliptic longitude. The ecliptic is, of course, the apparent path that the sun travels around the Earth, right? So the sun travels 1 degree ecliptic longitude per day. There's 30 degrees in one sign. We have 30 days in 1 month. We have 12 signs. We have 12 months, right? Of course, the zodiac is created by the interaction of the path of the sun with the path of the moon, right? It's, in fact, that interaction that defines the marker points of the signs. But it's the sun that, creates the signs, right? In Vedic astrology, the signs are called rashis, and a rashi is a bundle of light. It means bundle of light, okay? Now, the original meaning of the term new moon was the first visible crescent of the moon after its conjunction with the sun, right? Now, during a new moon, the sun combusts the moon, right? The sun is behind the rays. It's in fact behind the sun, astronomically speaking, looking at it from our perspective, because see, in Vedic astrology, this is referred to as ashta, which means setting, right? So like the sun sets, right? The sun rises and the sun sets. Also planets do that, right? In relation to the sun. Another term used is anashta, which means lost sight of. When planets are on the complete opposite side of the sun, they're closest to the Earth, right? So you're going to have the planet, you're going to have the Earth, and you're going to have the sun. This is when planets are retrograde. It's a little different for Mercury and Venus, but for Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars, it's like that, astronomically speaking, because they revolve around the Earth, right? And Mercury and Venus only travel around the sun. They don't travel around the Earth. But when planets are on the opposite side of the sun, right, the furthest away from the sun, these planets are retrograde. And you can see, as we speak, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto are retrograde. So they're closest to the Earth. And astrologically speaking, they can give more, right? Some people are of the opinion that they're becoming a little more rebellious, right? Because, they associate them with the nodes, and nodes go in the opposite direction of the planets, right? But they're closer to the Earth, so their disks become brighter, so they become more powerful. But when planets are combust, they're behind the sun. They have set behind the sun, okay? So here, moon is not visible. So it's an observational phenomenon. We can't see them, so it's a time to reflect, right? The moon represents the mind, right? In the mind lives our ideas and so on. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. The sun and the moon are also the two luminaries. From our perspective on Earth, they are the brightest and the largest objects. If you look at sun and moon on the horizon, they are equal in size, right? It means that they're equally important because the sun, of course, represents the fully masculine part of our psyche, and the moon represents the fully feminine counterpart, reflects the light of the sun. So moon and sun are two luminaries, and they're also called sattvic planets. The two luminaries, are going to be connected to our true nature, right? And they're two of the three sattvic planets. Jupiter is also a sattvic planet, and sattva translates as true essence. So they reflect, or they represent, symbolize the true essence of our being, which is kind of a beautiful natural symbolism. Now let's talk a little bit about the sun. See, the sun is our source of life, our source of energy, right? Our physiological life, regarded as an energy process, is entirely solar. Therefore, the sun represents the light of consciousness, our soul, the divine spark, right? That intuitive connection to the whole. Sun represents our core identity, our ideology, our self-esteem also. So whenever you see the sun afflicted in horoscope by Saturn, Venus, or Ketu, or Rahu, there's going to be self-esteem issues. Of course, you know, Saturn is the bastard child of the sun in mythology. There's a very complicated relationship between those two archetypes. Sun is, of course, representing the soul. Saturn is the furthest away from that. So it represents our inner lack, right? Our mortality, right? If the sun is that eternal spark within each of us, then Saturn is the thing that ends the body, right? It rules the body. It's going to end the body when the physical karmas are worked through. Of course, astronomically speaking, the sun is the furthest away, Saturn is the furthest away from the sun, right? It's the slowest moving planet. We can see this here when we look at the South Indian chart. We have here the signs of Leo and Cancer, which represent the north, right? This is where the sun reaches its highest point relative to the equator. And then the furthest away from that are the signs of Saturn, which is Capricorn and Aquarius. So whenever Saturn is in the sun, is in the signs of Saturn, or when it's strongly aspected by Saturn, it's going to feel self-esteem issues. There's going to be ego battles. There's going to be all sorts of things coming out of that. Of course, you know, that's the human drama and the human complex, right? The opposition between the sun, the soul, our inspiration, and Saturn with our inner lack. So it's a very common thing that a sun is starved by Saturn. Sun is also starved by Venus, right? So whenever sun is in the signs of Venus, so in Taurus or Libra, or strongly aspected by Venus, sun is not going to feel great. It's going to feel starved, in fact. And because Venus is looking at the sun, it's creating an experience to the sun. Sun is, of course, number one, right? It's not going to feel great because, you know, Venus wants to fulfill its responsibilities through the sun, which is not going to happen. So it's not going to be able to wield that power. And then also, whenever the sun is conjunct Rahu or Ketu, right? Whenever it's conjunct Ketu, you will feel that the person is quite capable with what that sun represents, but there's also strong ego attachment. You'll find a lot of doubt, right? In, you know, kind of aggressively exerting oneself when this is necessary. There will always be like a pulling back, an immense doubt. You know, this is always a sun Ketu conjunction. This is quite a challenging thing, especially for a man, as you know, the sun is that fully masculine force. Rahu sun conjunctions are difficult because a person just simply doesn't know who they are or what they're here to do in the first, you know, part of life, for sure. For Ketu sun, it's always important. Perfection is never going to be attained. So it's whatever you do well enough. It's more than enough. And then Rahu sun is just, you know, have to find out who they truly are and what they're here to do, what their sun is really asking of them. Let's talk a little bit about the moon now. See, the moon represents our conditioned consciousness. It symbolizes our individualized consciousness, our subjective experience of the soul, of the sun, right? The moon reflects the light of the sun. The moon is the planet of evolution. Of course, the nodes of the moon are strongly symbolizing that, right? Radical transformation. And it's because they are the nodes of the moon, right? Which are created or come into being because of the interaction of the path of the moon with that of the sun, right, with the ecliptic. So change, evolution. The moon is assigned the sign of Cancer, right, where the sun reaches its highest point relative to the equator. The most northern point is where the moon gets assigned its sign. Of course, Cancer is a movable cardinal sign, so the moon is waxing and waning. It's very, erratic in terms of declination and so on. So we assign the moon to Cancer. And of course, the sun to Leo, right? Leo is a fixed sign in terms of modality. So it's where the sun gets stable on its path relative to that season. It's not going to change in that season at all, right? So that's why it's a fixed modality. But the moon is, of course, the planet of evolution. It rules Cancer. Cancer is symbolized by a crab, which lives on land and water. So it, symbolizes that evolution. Now, the moon is depicted on a chariot with 10 horses, right? It's a bit similar to the sun, which is depicted on a chariot with 7 horses, which represent planets. But the moon is represented on a chariot with 10 horses. The first 5 represent the senses, all right? So that's why we say the moon is the manas, right? The moon is the sense mind. In the moon lives the idea of separate existence, which is the ego or the ahamkara, because without it, we can simply not become individual human beings. Also in the moon lives the jiva, which is the conscious living entity, which has a life force. It's the thing that makes us truly human. So it's a sense mind. So it rules the senses, or it's connected to the senses rather. And the other 5 forces are the moon's reaction or interaction to the stimuli of those senses. So moon is the sense mind, the mana. So in the moon lives our ideas, our longings, our concepts, our emotions. What makes us stick deeply on an emotional level is important. And we have in transit Rahu in the sign of Cancer, right, which is all about developing that emotional inner fire, which is pivotal, which is fundamental in how we direct our energy. So moon is the planet of adaptation. Whenever the environment puts a lot of pressure on the organism, we're going to have to evolve. We're going to have to maximize our opportunities for survival. This is all strongly connected to the moon. When we look at a new moon or a full moon, we're talking about these two main players, right? Everything is kind of below that. I mean, in the royal court of the planets, the sun and the moon are the king and the queen. Whenever there's an affliction to Venus, when the moon is strong, it's going to help that. Whenever moon is weak and Venus is weak, it's difficult, especially in a woman's horoscope. But when Venus is doing well, right, being in the 10th house, for example, can give some power, or when it's in good dignity and so on. Some good Palladia Vastas, Jagradadia Vastas, Lagitadia Vastas. So there's many things to consider. Then, that is going to help the moon out. Then all these masculine forces, when sun is bad and Mars or Jupiter is good, it's going to help out. Now, the new moon is happening in the sign of Gemini. So what does Gemini represent? This is coming from a book I co-authored, Astrology Explained, Ancient Principles for the Modern Mind. Now, first of all, what Gemini has to say about it is, Gemini is always very brief, and Gemini Upadesha Sutras is a very important astrological text. And he says about Gemini, also for Virgo, he gives that itches and stoutness, density, right? That's what he says. It's very brief. Itches and stoutness, density. Of course, itches relates to the skin being the largest organ. Its outer layer connects us to the exterior world. Itches prioritizing important ideas over trivial ideas. This is an important point. See, whenever you have, for example, Mars in the signs of Mercury, right? Mars doesn't like to be there. Often the person is argumentative, or too emotionally, or too argumentative, or just hanging on to being too fiery, defending their own points of view when it's really not necessary, or when it's out of place even. Also stoutness, right? So when you hold on to certain ideas, mental concepts, and density as well. So like mental density and not being really flexible, right? As a dual sign. And Mercury is, of course, a neutral planet. It's a very flexible planet. It's involved with so many things in life. And so, when Mercury's signs are afflicted, it's a little more difficult. Not necessarily that Mercury is going to suffer, but the signs and whatever these signs represent may be suffering. Okay, so that's what Gemini represents from the Gemini angle. Now, Prashra gives front rising, a pair of humans with mace and with lute, Western, airy, two-footed, night strong, village roaming, Vata, normal limbed, grass colored is the pair ruled by Mercury. Okay, so let's break it down a little bit. Gemini is an air sign. Air is moderately masculine. All odd signs are masculine, and all masculine signs are also cruel signs. So air relates to Kama, right, which is the west direction. It's where the sun sets, right, in the west. So taking things easy, developing your communicative skills, right? As the original third sign of the zodiac, it connects to the third house, and the third house is the house of your skills. See, in Aries, we have that initial spark, the initial thought, let's say. In Taurus, we have the senses, developing of the senses. And in Gemini, we experiment with things like the baby or the child, the toddler starts to walk, starts to take its first steps. So we experiment there. That's why it's a sign of experimentation. There's no planets debilitated or exalted in Gemini. So in that sense, it's more neutral, right? So it's where we have the time to experiment with things and to develop our communicative skills as an air sign, right? So communication, partnering up with people, right? Creating rapport with people, very important, as Gemini is symbolized by a pair of humans. The old texts also give, like, it's important sign for relationships, for example. It's one human with a mace, one human with a lute. So it symbolizes both destructive as well as creative capabilities. It's a very versatile sign. It can come from either way. Like the communicative skills, because it's ruled by Mercury, of course. Mercury rules that. Mercury is that interface between what is happening within and without. And so it's very important in terms of decoding, deciphering things, making sense of things, right? And objectively observing things. And so, you know, Gemini is developing that. It's developing the skills to communicate, to partner up with people. When you have this North Node there, for example, there it's going to be important to develop that quality. It's two-footed. It's a human sign or a biped. And bipeds, human signs, are more strongly connected than other signs to their self-expression. Of course, also fire signs are connected to self-expression and expressing who they truly are, right, on a level of self. But two-footed also can have that connotation, also involved in intellectual affairs and so. Village roaming, so Gemini connects to cities, right? If we look at it these days, it's connecting to cities. Gemini is also a Rajasic sign, right? Rajas means mist, and it's strongly connected to passion, right? We have Sattvic signs, Tamasic signs. Gemini needs to follow their desires, and they have to be passionate about things, right? Passionately communicating whatever they need to communicate, right? They can be very experimental. That's why Gemini is associated with inventors, but also war criminals and so on, right? Because it is symbolized by a man with a mace. But Vata is the movement, right? Vata is the movement between Pitta and Kapha, right? Pitta is that active quality, Kapha is that passivity, right? And so Vata is the movement in between, from one state to the other and back. So it needs that movement, right? It has that air quality. It's normal limb, so that the size is normal, right? It's like average sized. And the color associated is cyan, right? Most texts give green, and some text gives blue. So if we combine that, it's cyan. Gemini, the sign of experimentation, the sign of communicating, of developing your communicative skills, partnering up. What is your creative potential? Whenever you have the North Node there, for example, it can show that the person just needs to get out of their self-centered way of looking at things and just experiment with new things, like just go out to some kind of place where they usually would not go to, and they can find some really interesting things there that can, you know, help them on their life path or with their interests and so on. It's also, as I mentioned, it's a Rajasic sign, right? So it's passionately interested in whatever it's interested in. As a cruel sign, because all odd signs are cruel signs as well. It's, you know, odd signs are masculine signs, so they want to do something, right? Gemini represents the body parts connected to Gemini are the hands, the arms, the shoulders, and the upper lungs. So Gemini is all about doing things. That's the key word here, doing things. And the fact that it's Rajasic, it's very passionate about doing things and experimenting with things. But as a cruel sign, at the same time, it can also just be too focused on its own interests. When they're interested in something, they're interested, but other interests or other people's interests are going to be difficult to relate to or to just give some attention. Gemini is playful, right? Mercury is the player. Mercury is also the planet of business as well, right? Mercury is the planet of communication, very objective, investigating things, right? It has that curiosity, of course. If we look at the transit, we see that Mercury is in its own sign. And at the time of this new moon, we have 4 planets in their own signs. Jupiter is in its own sign. Saturn is in its own sign. Mercury is in its own sign still. It's the end of the Mercury sign. So it's in a Mrita state, in a dead state when we consider Baladya Vastas. I will talk a little bit about that as well. And Venus is also in its own sign. We have a trine between Pluto and Venus. Now we see that Mars is coming closer to its conjunction with the North Node, right? Mars-Rahu connections are a little volatile, right? Mars is the cruelest of the cruel planets. Mars is the way we exert our energy. It's in the sign of Cancer, where it's debilitated. Of course, Moon is going to delight it at the same time, right? Moon is a friend towards Mars, but it can create some problems in terms of your volition, like you're using your will most constructively. Sometimes when Mars is afflicted, we react emotional where we should react or act logical, for example. And of course, Rahu is that eclipse point, right? Rahu is always making things bigger, exploding things. So it's important to keep cool, right? And because it's in a kind of an aggressive combination, Rahu and Mars, it's going to be, coming into an opposition with Saturn there. So Saturn-Mars oppositions are not fun, right? Because they're the 2 malefic planets. Mars is, of course, the cruelest and is inimical towards Saturn. So it's going to create some problems there. But Saturn is strong in its own sign. Saturn is connected still to Pluto, right? It's going a little I mean, they're still closely conjunct, so a lot of intensity in respect to the sign of Capricorn, also a lot of manifesting influence, of course, because Saturn manifests its own sign there. The South Node shows where we have to let go of, right? This is an ongoing process, been going on for months. But then we also have a trine between Pluto and Venus, right? Venus, of course, strong in its own sign. Pluto is, relating to Shiva. Pluto is, wants to destroy the barrier between the individual consciousness, which is represented by Uranus, and the collective consciousness, which is represented by Neptune. And of course, Pluto shows us how we misuse or underuse, or how we direct our energy. It wants to rectify that in a way, right? So whatever we are too attached to certain patterns that are negative, right, or that are old, and Pluto's job, which is related to Shiva, right, is to destroy that structure, and then Uranus comes in with the new, right? This is how we look at it. And here we see a trine to Venus. Venus is, of course, the planet of relationships, the karaka of significator of relationships in the sign of Taurus. It also has a wealth connotation, being the strongest of these earth signs, which is all about, fulfilling your senses and fulfilling your material needs. So, there's a good chance here. This is a very harmonious aspect to resolve any relationship issues and to really examine, like Pluto is going to do that when it's with a trine, to examine where you have been misusing that energy, right? It's also in terms of your self-value. So what is your value? There's a very powerful point there. And of course, as I mentioned, Venus is very strong there in its own sign, but also in a Kumara state. Kumara is one of the Baladi Avastas, right? So when you look at planets, you can look at the dignity, you can look at its Baladi Avasta, Jagradadi Avasta, Lajitadi Avasta, and even Shayanadi Avasta. So there's many conditions that a planet can be in, and we have to examine all of them to get a clear understanding, because things are multi-layered, right? Multi-dimensional even, but multi-layered is a better word in terms of how our existence and our consciousness, how we experience things. But here, Venus on a concrete level can manifest, right? It manifests, any planet that conjuncts its own sign manifests that sign. So it's manifesting Taurus. It's also in a Kumara state. The Baladi Avastas are showing the maturation level of the planets. It shows how young or old the karma relating to that planet is, right? So it represents, Venus represents women, relationships, as a natural indicator, but also it's going to rule 2 signs in your horoscope. You can also look at these connotations as well. Saturn is also in a Kumara state, right? This is when a planet is between 18 and 24 degrees of an even sign. So they're quite powerful in manifesting their signs right now. So whatever they may represent, if Saturn is your 7th house or Capricorn is your 7th house, then in terms of relationships, even though there's a lot of pressure going on there, and even though Mars is going to aspect that Saturn, right, that 7th lord for Cancer ascendant, Saturn is strong. It's going to be able to maintain all factors equal. Right? It's going to be able to manifest some stuff in that house, especially because of its Baladia Vasta, right? On a concrete level, it can create some things there. Also, it relates to clients, for example. The 7th house is the house of trade. And then Mercury and Jupiter are also in their own signs. Mercury is where, this new moon is happening, very important. And that sign is strongly manifesting, right? So we have Jupiter and Mercury strongly manifesting the sign of Gemini. Mercury is in the last 6 degrees of an odd sign, which is in a dead state, and Jupiter is in the between 18 and 24 degrees of an odd sign, which is in an old state, Vrida state. Okay, so in terms of concrete manifestation, they're a little weak, but Jupiter and Mercury are the 2 manifesting grahas according to Gemini, and so they're definitely gonna, by Rashi aspect and conjunction, gonna manifest that sign. So whatever Gemini represents is under manifesting influence for you. It has been for quite some time since Mercury has entered Gemini. But there's a new moon there, right? So there's new beginnings there. So if that happens in your 1st house, it can relate to your life path, to your body, to your health. If it's your 2nd house, it can relate to your resources, the things that you need to be fulfilled, the things that you need to feel supported on the path, right? Like money, for example, or also your close family. And the 3rd house relates to your skills, commerce, your intellect, technical writing, technical intelligence, 3rd house, short distance travel, and so on. The 4th house is the house of your home, luxuries, the mother, right? How secure you feel. This is what the 4th house is. The 5th house is the house of children, the house of knowledge, right? The house of continuance, consistency. The 6th house is the house of enemies, the house of accidents, your daily routine, It's a house of intelligence also in Gemini, right? It's, tackling the daily problems makes you smarter, right? Seventh house is the house of relationships, trade, long distance travel. The eighth house, the occult house, right? The shared resources, intimacy, sexuality also, right? The eighth house is important. The ninth house, the house of teachers, pilgrimages, so travel that inspires you, spiritual affairs, right? Everything that is greater than yourself is the ninth house. When the new moon is happening in, your 10th house is going to relate to your career or your obligations, maybe the father, authority figures, and so on. The 11th house is the house of gains, the house of your hopes and dreams and your long-term investments and so on. And then the 12th house is the house of losses and expenses, isolated places, ashrams, and so on. So you can see how this, all these, connotations, all these symbolisms kind of manifest for you during that period. It's always important, right? So it's, the new moon is the first phase of the moon, right? So it's gonna, 2 weeks later, it's gonna reach full, right? It's gonna reflect that light fully, that sunlight fully on the sign that it's transiting. So it's important always to look at, in anything that you're examining, like the transit of the moon is important. And from new moon to full moon is a waxing phase, right? It's where we build things. It's where we, on a concrete and, level, can manifest things. When it's from waxing to waning, it's, decreasing, right, in strength. So it's more like about internal growth and letting go of things, or letting the things that have been initiated in the waxing phase, let them evolve, let them play out. Okay, so a good time for breakthroughs in terms of relationship fulfillment, let's say, or whatever problems you have been going through in terms of relationships. Pluto trine Venus is a good point. It's always intense. When Pluto is involved, even in a trine, it's always intense, but it's a very harmonious aspect. And we have the new moon in Gemini, which is manifesting because of the manifesting influence of Jupiter and Mercury. We have an opposition of Mars, coming closer to its opposition with Saturn, and also conjuncting the North Node, which is something to watch for, right? So just keep it cool. Of course, this is a general overview, right? You have to look at your own personal horoscopes and see how these transiting planets influence in the certain natal positions in your horoscope. I hope you have a good cycle, right? New moon cycle, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.